A Heroine's Beginning, Chapter 9. Myself, Daniel, and Clara arrived back at home around midday. My younger siblings were delighted to see us. Gwyn practically threw herself at me, her curls bouncing in the wind. I was not in the mood for smiling. I tried to act happy to see her, but in my heart I was too drained to try. It was finally hitting me that Sir Henry, the kind, fair man I had worked for the last 3 years, was gone. I knew my grief could never match Ella's. I could not imagine losing a parent like that. But I was quite fond of the master, and it upset me that he had died. We walked through the door, our heads hanging low. My mother turned around, surprised, and looked at us confused. We placed down our bags and began to explain the events of last night and this morning. She didn't say a word, but when we were done, she stood up and wrapped her arms around us. "Oh, my dears, I'm so sorry," she whispered at us. Her voice sounded a little hoarse, like she had been fighting off a cold. I looked up at her curiously, and she coughed. "I'm sorry. I'm just feeling a little under the weather," she told me, and then smiled. "Nothing I'm not used to. Now you need to go and unpack. Marion and Clara, you can move back into Gwyn's room. The mattresses are kept under the bed. And Daniel, you can go back to the boys' room. Robbie can go back to the boys' room again, too." She moved to the closet and started pulling out sheets. "Marion, I think you should go and tell your father what's happened. He should be in the wheat field with Alexander." She coughed again. I moved forward, but she batted me away. "I'm fine, really. Go and find your father." I nodded and went to go and find Father and Alexander. I walked down the lane toward the wheat fields. The sun was shining brightly, making the golden fields almost glow in the summer sun. Butterflies danced around me as I walked, but my mind was too distracted to notice the beauty of the day, the lack of sleep, and the dread of telling my father the story of the last few hours did not marry well in my mind. As I rounded the corner and passed through the gate, I saw about 20 men harvesting the wheat with scythes. The mechanical motion of swishing the scythe back and forth was familiar to all of them, and to me. I had spent a lot of time in my childhood underneath the apple trees on the far side of the field with my siblings. We'd sit there for hours playing games of cards and dice. Our father was supposed to be watching us, but he was always busy working, and more often than not we would amuse ourselves. Mother would be occupied with the little ones, so I was left in charge. Unfortunately, the downside of putting me in charge at such a young age was I was adventurous and liked exploring. This led to Daniel breaking his arm after falling out of a tree at age 7. After that incident, Father would pay much closer attention to us. We were forced to sit and watch the men working with the scythes. We were not allowed to run off or climb anything. This is how we would sit for hours coming up with stories to tell each other. Many of them I wrote down on the cover of the Exodia book. I glanced up, and I instantly spotted my brother Alexander. His tawny curls stood out amongst the other heads with short, straight hair. He always liked to wear it long. Mother hated it. She thought boys should have short hair. It made it much easier to handle. He only ever had short hair once, when he discovered the pain of having long hair brushed. Over time, he cut it just short enough to avoid having to brush it daily, but long enough to annoy Mother a little. I waved at Alexander. He didn't look up for a minute. He was concentrating on the task of not injuring himself with the large blade in his hand. When he stopped to wipe the sweat away from his brow, he looked up and saw me waving. He shouted something I couldn't hear to the man next to him. The man turned around, and I saw the face of my father. He smiled at me. They both picked up their scythes and made their way toward me. I tried to smile back at them, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. When they were closer, I noted the change in both of them. My Sunday visits happened at such a time that I only occasionally saw my father, when the weather was too bad to work. And the same thing with Alexander when he started to work in the fields a year ago. Father had always been tall, broad-shouldered, but not enough to be intimidating. Due to the fact that he worked in the fields doing manual labor all day, meant that he always looked strong. But he had always had a kind look in his eyes, caring and considerate. Alexander had changed too. He had become taller, and he was now almost the same height as my father. People had always said that Alexander looked like my father, but with lighter-colored hair. I had not realized how right they were until now. At 16 years old, he did look exactly like a younger version of Joshua Brown. They stopped in front of me, placing the heavy scythes down on the ground. My father opened his arms and embraced me. "Marion, how nice to see you." His voice had a magic effect on me. It made me feel safe and happy. It comforted me slightly, but not enough to make me smile. He pulled back to look at me. His brow creased in confusion when he saw my expression. But before he could say anything, Alexander had picked me up and began to spin me around. "Ari!" This had been his pet name for me ever since he could talk. We discovered that Marion is quite a difficult word for a toddler to say, so the resulting mess of sound that came out of his mouth when addressing me sounded more like Ari, and the name stuck. He set me down, beaming, my father still looking confused. "Marion, why are you here? It's not Sunday," Father asked. "Shouldn't you be at work?" I looked down at the ground. "I do not have work to go to anymore. I was dismissed this morning," I informed them in a quiet voice. "Why? What happened?" he said, his voice sounding worried. "Sir Henry is dead. He caught the fever last night. Lady Kingston told us all to leave at once." "That's horrid," Alexander exclaimed. "Poor Miss Ella. She's now an orphan. That must be hard." "It was horrible. Lady Kingston threw us all out, and she doesn't like Ella at all. I don't know why, but she doesn't." "Did she say why she was dismissing you?" Father asked. "She told us that their new financial circumstances forced them to make certain economies," I told him, impersonating her ladyship's shrill voice. "So does this mean your brother and sister are back home?" he asked. I nodded. "Well, it will be nice to have them home again, and we'll have enough saved up for the three of you to have a small break from working for a while. But is there any chance you could get your position back? Or a new one?" he asked hopefully. I hung my head and shook it. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him raise his eyebrows questioningly. "Marion, what did you do?" he asked. When I didn't respond, he asked again. "Marion?" I may have shouted at Lady Kingston, calling her a witch and a stone-cold monster, I told him quietly. He stared at me incredulously. There was a moment of silence. Then he broke the quiet with a loud chuckle. "That's my girl," he said, tapping the end of my nose like he did when I was a child. Alexander laughed now. I allowed myself to breathe. He wasn't mad. When they had quieted down, he looked at me. "Although we could do with the money, she deserved that. I'm glad I've never met the woman, but even if she's partially like what you've described, then she deserved all of that and worse. You've always been a force for your own good, but this time I think it was warranted." He turned to Alexander. "I think it's about time we ate our lunch, don't you?" Alexander nodded enthusiastically and walked off to retrieve the satchel containing the food. Father sat down on the grass and gestured for me to join him. "Now, are you going to tell me exactly what happened?" he asked. I began retelling the night's events in as much detail as I could remember. I relived the happy arrival of Sir Henry, the screaming of Ella when she found him, the carrying him to the bed, and the long, long night of waiting with Ella, slowly watching the life drain out of him. Alexander came and joined us on the grass, listening attentively. We stayed there for a good while. I lost track of how long we actually sat there. Somehow telling someone else about it did make it feel slightly better. I finished my tale, and we sat there talking about nothing in particular. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Daniel running down the lane. My father waved at him, smiling at the 14-year-old. His smile dropped when he noticed Daniel's haste and serious face. I began to wonder what was the matter. Alexander stood up, confused. "Hurry, quickly!" Daniel shouted. "Hurry!" We all stood up at that and began hastily to make our way toward him. "What is it?" Alexander shouted back at Daniel. "It's Mother," Daniel shouted. "She collapsed. Help!" My heart stopped, and I filled with panic. I began to run after Daniel, Alexander slightly in front of me, and Father behind, mumbling the word "no" over and over again. We sped down the lane, not caring about the shortness of breath or the pain in my side. Alexander caught up to Daniel by this point and was asking him questions about what happened. From the snippets of conversation I could hear, I pieced together the story. Mother had been coughing ever since we had returned from the manor, and had dismissed it as another small or trifling illness. Daniel had not been concerned until the coughing was so bad her muscles forced her to bend over. Then, instead of coughing, she was sick all over the floor. They had gone to see if she was okay, when they saw blood in the sick. Then she swooned and fainted into Daniel's arms. He had shouted to Richard to go run for Dr. Smith, and told Clara to look after her while he ran to collect us. I knew instantly what had happened. She had caught the fever. She was not going to survive. When we arrived at the house, Dr. Smith was already examining her, Clara holding her hand. Gwyn, Robbie, and Tom were huddled in the corner of the room. Gwyn was crying, and Robbie looked on the verge of tears. We stopped to breathe, but Father hurried to Mother's side and took Clara's place. When I had caught my breath, I walked over to the little ones and sat down with them, taking Gwyn and Robbie onto my lap, and tried to distract them. Alexander began to pace the room, and Daniel had to sit down. He had run twice the distance we had. It seemed like forever, but could only have been a few minutes, when Dr. Smith walked away from Mother's bed and tapped Father on the shoulder, beckoning him to follow. He reluctantly gave Alexander Mother's hand and followed. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was full. This could not be happening. I could not lose my mother. It was too unfair. I could not lose 2 people in 2 days. I didn't need to wait for Dr. Smith to tell us. I knew. Sir Henry had done the exact same thing. I watched as my mother's chest rose and fell quickly. There was a muffled cry that came from behind the door. My father had been told the worst. He was about to lose his wife. The others were old enough to guess what the sound meant, and their faces fell. Clara started to sob, which upset Gwyn, who began to cry again. I started to sing to calm her. Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Remember me to the one who lives there. She was once a true love of mine. Alexander, Daniel, Clara, and Richard all began to sing slowly, one by one. Our mother had sung it to us since we were in the cradle. Tell her to make me a tamarick shirt, parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, without a seam or needlework. Then she'll be a true love of mine. The door opened, and the shell of my father walked in. His head hung so low, I was surprised he was still standing. He paused next to where Clara was standing and placed his arm around her. I could tell it was not just to comfort her. He was using her as support. Joshua, My mother's voice sounded from across the room. We all looked at her. "All of you," she said. "Come here." Father made his way to her side quickly, sitting on the far side of the bed and lifting her into his arms. I placed Robbie and Gwyn down, took their hands in mine, and began to slowly walk toward the sickbed. Tears were now falling freely down my face. I wasn't sure when they began, but I made no effort to stop them. I sat next to Richard, who was by her shoulder, and once again picked up Gwyn and Robbie, placing them on the bed in front of me. Gwyn lay her little head down on Mother's lap. She was still crying. Alexander lifted Tom up to the bed, and Clara stood next to him. Daniel stood at the foot of the bed. I reached forward and took hold of Mother's hand. Her breathing was shallow, and her pulse was weak. Her eyes looked around all of us, and she opened her mouth. "I know this will be hard," she said, "but I have to leave you now." Father bent his head down to kiss her forehead. "But I want you all to know how much I love you, and how sorry I am to go." She coughed again, and a little blood dripped from the corner of her mouth. Father lovingly wiped it away. "I'm relying on you," she said, looking at me, Alexander, and Daniel, "to look after each other and your father." I nodded slowly, and Alexander and Daniel followed. "Be happy. I'm going to a better place, and I will always be watching over you." Her breaths were getting shallow now. "And promise me one more thing. Have an adventure like in your stories. Go and fight the dragons, rescue the damsels, defeat the sorcerers. Go and live your lives well, and make me proud." Her eyes began to close, but she looked up at Father. "Joshua, I love you." She closed her eyes, but kept breathing. They were few and far between now, but she opened her mouth one last time. "I love you all. Never forget I love you." Her breathing stopped. Father bent and kissed her head, tears falling without restraint. She was gone. I was now motherless. We were all now motherless. There was a large hole in my heart that could never be filled again. Sadness consumed my entire being. Robbie turned his head to me and held out his arms. I held him, his tears staining my dress, as mine stained his shirt. She was gone.